Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is absolutely wonderful to see you. Thanks for hopping on in here. Hey, it's wonderful to be part of your week and it's wonderful that you're part of our community. And hey, this week, much like we do, this week, oh my goodness, things have been so wild in the last couple of weeks. I can't even really catch my breath from the NHS banning puberty blocker treatments for people under 18, which is wild, introducing indefinite restrictions to the prescription of those medications solely for gender diverse folk for the reasons of gender dysphoria, right? Still prescribing them with abandon for people who are experiencing precocious puberty. Seems to be fine for those folk, but for trans folk, absolutely not. So an almost indefinite ban, which seems like a huge step to take. And the central government supporting this has even introduced an emergency ban, which even the health minister described as like quite an unusual use of this power. They used an emergency ban to ban overseas prescriptions for puberty blockers. So young people who are receiving puberty blockers using overseas prescriptions, even if they're getting them from highly qualified medical professionals, cannot now get those filled in the UK and will have to stop taking them. That's what the UK government seems to be suggesting, which would force these young people down a puberty that isn't necessarily right for them. I can only imagine the distress and uncertainty that young people are experiencing right now. And as we try to catch our breath, just trying to reeling in the community from such an extraordinary act from central government, the central government then announces that it's planning to change the Equality Act. And this really is endgame stuff for the community. We enjoy protections from the Equality Act, and because of public kind of perceptions of prejudice towards the transgender community, at some point we will do a kind of an episode on workplace prejudice and workplace discrimination, because I think there's some really interesting research out there on that, and the employment stats for the trans community are pretty poor because of that discrimination. There's an interesting study done on the sort of technology sector, and they found something like a third of people working in the technology sector just openly said they wouldn't hire a transgender person, which is wild to me. So we will definitely do an episode on that to really get to grips with that literature. But because of all of that, the Equality Act becomes one of the few places that transgender people can go to get some kind of protection. We can't be discriminated against because people perceive us to be transgender, but they also can't discriminate against us for being the gender that we are in the world, right? And that's an important thing. It's an important protection. Importantly, right, the Equality Act protects people on the basis of perception, right? That's really important. So somebody doesn't have to be something in order to be discriminated against and to be protected from discrimination. So if somebody thinks of you, they look at you and they think you are transgender, then they discriminate against you because of your gender identity. Even if you are not transgender, you can still be protected under the law for that reason. And here we have Kemi Badenoch, Right Honourable Kemi Badenoch, announcing a change in the law, a change in the Equality Act planned if the Conservatives remain in power, which is absolutely, I cannot overstate this, it is groundbreaking and terrible for the community. And for all of us, I hasten to add, because if you are perceived to be a woman under the law right now, regardless of whether you are one or whether you identify as one, if somebody discriminates against you because they perceive you to be a woman, then you are protected under the law. Someone perceives you to be a man and they discriminate against you because of that, you are protected under the law. And it seems that the Right Honourable Kemi Badenoch and central government want to change that so that you are only protected if you have been assigned that gender at birth. Or it seems to suggest if you are biologically that sex, but the question of biology is actually quite complicated because people have differences of sexual developments. You can't really lean on the question of like chromosomes because, you know, lots of people, like people with androgen insensitivity syndrome, have XY chromosomes, but are often identify as women, are girls from assigned female at birth and, are raised as girls and women in the world, and yet they have XY chromosomes. So, you really can't lean on chromosomes as some kind of permanent like fixture of biology that allows you to kind of determine somebody's sex. You also can't really rely on sex assigned at birth because obviously lots of people transition. But not only that, you have people with differences of sexual development whose assignment at birth is, often wrong, where there isn't a clear way to assign somebody at birth, and maybe the way in which they identify is different to how somebody has been assigned. The question of assignment at birth is actually quite problematic for lots of people with differences of sexual development. So actually, there's lots of reasons to question the question of assignment at birth at all. And yet here, central government want to enshrine in law, you are only protected as a woman if you were assigned female at birth or if you are biologically a woman, without really being able to define what that means. And here we have the Right Honourable Kemi Badenoch talking about exactly that change in the law. So here is Secretary of State for the Department of Business and Trade. She's also Secretary of State for the International Trade and the President of the Board of Trade. And she is Minister for Women and Equalities for the Equality Hub. This is Kemi Badenoch.
So what we are doing is clarifying that the Equality Act, where it refers to sex, is referring specifically to biological sex and not legal sex, as is often interpreted. So this is a clarification in the law. It is not, as many people assume, a change. It is re-emphasising what should be the status quo. We have seen quite a lot of changes in terms of terminology. In the law, sex and gender were used interchangeably. Now we don't do that. So what we're doing is making sure that people understand what the law says. We've seen a lot of problems with people misinterpreting the law.
Thanks so much to Kemi Badenoch, who clearly wants us all to know that transgender people aren't losing their rights. They just want to clarify the law to establish that transgender people never had the rights they thought they had to begin with. A cold comfort for the trans community, I think. pretty cold comfort. But thanks to Kemi Badenoch for such an interesting question posed, as they often are in the form of confident declaration. Not much I could do with this one. Hey, we've come for our rights, fine, goodness me. But I do get that central government are, they are running out of time. It's not long now before a general election, and it's unlikely that the Conservative Party will do well in that election, given how things are going. And I understand that they're trying to do something which the Labour Party can't easily do too. Hopefully, won't do too. And if the Labour Party says, well, we're not going to change the Equality Act, then the Conservative Party can point to, oh, well, we're the party of women, you see. Labour Party doesn't know what a woman is. Oh, as if we haven't all had it up to the teeth with all of this stuff. But hey, listen, I'm not going to take this one as a question. I refuse. I can't think of a good question to take. So instead, let's hear from Kevin Lister, who's part of the Bad Law Project, which I think was created in opposition to the Good Law Project. He was speaking on Talk TV recently about gender identity and particularly about social transition. So here is Kevin Lister and Talk TV.
A kid is confused. They go to their teacher. They say, oh, I'm a boy, I think I'm a girl. I'm a girl, I think I'm a boy. They're transitioned socially, so they call them by a different name or different gender. But instead of that sort of assuaging things and calming things down, the CAS review, we think, is going to be saying that literally sets you on that railroad track directly towards puberty blockers and everything else.
Exactly. And the problem is it's been systemic. So that situation that you're talking about, where a teacher would normally intervene with a child, with a student of theirs when there's an issue and say, make sure you understand what you're doing and don't put yourself at harm and so forth. That's normally what a teacher would do. But with the trans movement, if a teacher does that, they are automatically in breach of the Equalities Act. So it can be done for harassment of the student, because the student now has got gender protected rights. So teachers have been in an impossible situation. So you've had teachers in an impossible situation, but also you've had teachers and schools who have been encouraging it, literally feeding their students into this medical experiment.
Thanks to Kevin Lister for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of confident declaration. But we'll take it for the question we think it was intended to be. And of course, it pertains one very last time to the CAS review. I wasn't going to do another episode on the CAS review, to be honest. I thought a two-parter was enough. But I took a look at the CAS review's kind of consideration of social transition. And I was interested because it got to a quite conservative place in the review, and I think it's advocating for quite a conservative place. And I think it's going to be difficult for schools and for parents and for young people themselves to know, what is it that the review is advocating for, or what is it that we should do? Like, particularly for schools, when you have a young person who's struggling in their gender and are deeply, deeply upset and want to socially transition, I think schools reading the review might consider that that is quite a risky thing to do to support a child to transition. And I wanted to look at the research. And the one thing that I really spotted in the review that I really sort of took me aback was 12.24. One study, CAS says, looking at transgender adults, found that lifetime suicide attempts and suicide ideation in the past year was higher among those who had socially transitioned as adolescents compared to those who had socially transitioned in adulthood. That was a startling finding to me, and if true, would be something to consider, right? And I decided then, I was compelled to go back to the literature and review the systematic review and to read all of the articles that went into the systematic review on the psychological outcomes of social transition. There are 11 studies in that review. 11 studies in that systematic review, again commissioned by the CAS review from the University of York. Very cool systematic review. I appreciate it. They didn't exclude the low quality evidence, which is, interesting, but I guess they couldn't here because they considered that most of the evidence was low quality. Only 11 studies, and they thought of 9 of them as being pretty low evidence. There are kind of 8 studies. There are 9 studies that look at psychological outcomes, of which one of them is a reanalysis of a bunch of other studies. So it's a sort of strange inclusion, I think. So I'm going to leave out number 9. That's Wong and colleagues. We're going to leave them out. So there are 8 studies looking at psychological outcomes. There's another 2 looking at gender identity outcomes. And one of them is Steensma, and the other one is Olson and Gulgos. And the 2 of those are kind of interesting studies. They both basically show that people who socially transition tend to continue in their transition into the future. The reason we're going to leave that to one side is because it's its own topic, and because the CAS review struggles to interpret those studies, because essentially, you can both sides this, unfortunately, right? So we say that let's say that we give social transition to 100 children, 95 of them continue on into transition into young adulthood. Do you consider that a good thing because only the people who needed to were socially transitioning, those genuinely transgender people were socially transitioning? Or do we think that it was a bad thing because it cemented them on a pathway that they couldn't escape from in the future? there's no way from either of those studies to be able to work out which it is. I tend to think of our own review of the literature that the former is more likely than the latter, but I can't be certain. So we're going to leave those two studies to one side. So we've got 8 studies to look through then, and try and work out which study it was that found that people socially transitioning in adolescence experienced greater sort of long-term mental health challenges than those only social transitioning in adulthood. We'll go find that article. But first, we've got Durwood and colleagues in 2017. Participants enrolled at the time of study in the Trans Youth Project, which was a national longitudinal study of socially transitioned children. So we have families of socially transitioned transgender children recruited through word of mouth and through support groups and summer camps and online forums. And ultimately, the kids came from 23 US states and 1 Canadian province. Children in the study needed to identify as the gender opposite to their, like the gender they were assigned at birth, i.e. they needed to be kind of binary transgender, and to have socially transitioned. So they needed to be using the pronoun associated with the gender with which they identified in all contexts. They had 63 trans kids in the study, 63 age-matched controls, and 38 siblings of trans kids, all between the ages of 9 to 14. And they found that the transgender children who had socially transitioned in the sample reported normative rates of depression and only slightly elevated rates of anxiety. Now, that anxiety point is going to continue to come back. And I think that anxiety point is going to be a major finding that we find here, that children who socially transition, particularly who socially transition in adolescence, have raised rates of anxiety. And we think the reason for that may very well be the level of social prejudice and discrimination and harassment they receive around their gender identity. Because, of course, that's the challenge of social transition, right? That social transition exposes you. You can't hide so easily if you socially transition. It creates an opportunity for that negativity and harassment in school and in the community. And so where we have children who are socially transitioning, it's not just the effects of social transition in and of itself that we're seeing. We're also seeing the consequences when social transition exposes you to society's harassment and discrimination. Now, the other big challenge in the research is that the socially transitioned children are, of course, and it's the case in Durwood's, in fact, it's the case in all of these studies, that, of course, they're supported at home, right? Like, either they're being recruited from gender clinics or they're being recruited from, like, word of mouth and support networks, etc., and support groups. But either way of recruitment, you're really only going to get people who are supportive of their children at home. It's going to be very difficult to find people who are not supportive of their children at home. And that's really important in the research because, yeah, sure, we're going to find that parental support is supportive of children, young people's emotional development when they're transgender or when they're gender questioning or when they're gender diverse in other ways. That's important, but that's in the context of general family affirmation of a child or young person. I'd be really interested in a study that looked at parents of children who are not well supported at home and look at the children's mental health outcomes in those situations where they're prohibited from social transition, for example. I think that'd be a really interesting study to do, exceptionally challenging to do, and that's why all 8 of these studies are with parents who are, generally speaking, quite positive. And some of the studies actually do look at parental support levels and find that, the vast majority of parents are very, very supportive of their children. So the next study is by Fontenary and colleagues, and we have covered this study before. Gender affirmation is associated with transgender and non-binary youth mental health improvement of Brazilian youth between the ages of 16 and 25. They looked to 706 adolescents who started the survey, and then whittled them down to 350 participants in the final analysis, just getting rid of the sort of nefarious responses and just like the people who weren't transgender or non-binary, for example. They got rid of all of those participants and they brought it down to 350 participants, all from Brazil. Now, these Brazilian youth in the study, they looked at both kind of support at home and social transition, and then they looked at kind of stages of medical transition. And we've looked at the medical transition bit, but I don't think we've covered the kind of affirmation bit. What they found is actually very interesting. They looked not only at kind of the act of social transition in broad terms, which is like the expression of one's true gender identity as they describe it in the study, which I have to say I really like that description. And they did find that people who were never able to express their true gender identity had more anxiety and depression symptoms compared to those who could express their true identity some or all of the time. But they also looked at like parental affirmation, which I think is one of the only studies that is able to do that. And they found that when fathers used their child's true name, that is the name associated with their sort of their true gender identity. See, I love the idea of true name and true gender identity. It's kind of beautiful. When fathers used their child's true name, these children exhibited fewer depressive symptoms. And the effect was strongest when fathers always used the true name. Really, really cool. And again, with mothers, when mothers used their child's true name, the young people had less anxiety and fewer depressive symptoms. And again, the effect was significant when mothers always used the true name. This, I think, is really interesting. So young people whose mothers used their true name also showed more gender positivity than those whose mothers used their name sometimes or never. So this is one of the first times we find that, parental affirmation is actually a big key player in young people's social transition, because of course social transition is the transition. Not only is it about performing your gender to yourself and seeing yourself in the mirror and feeling affirmed in your gender, but it's also a social invitation to the people around you to affirm your gender, your true gender. And so when you do it and your parents don't use your name, then that non-affirmation kind of undermines the function of social transition. So, we're going to see this again with Russell, Lee, and Pollitt. In fact, let's take a look at Russell, Lee, and Pollitt now, because they were also in the systematic review. Chosen name use is linked to reduced depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior among transgender youth. A community cohort sample of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth, and youth with same-sex attraction recruited in 3 US cities. The sample ultimately included 129 transgender and gender non-conforming youth between the ages of 15 and 21, 74 of whom reported a chosen name different from the name given at birth. And after they adjusted for personal characteristics and total social support, they found that chosen name use in more contexts predicted fewer depressive symptoms and less suicidal ideation and less suicidal behavior. They found, in fact, that an increase by one context in which a chosen name use could be used predicted a 29% decrease in suicidal ideation and a 56% decrease in suicidal behavior. So here we have a pretty good, between the two studies, pretty good evidence that parental support is actually really, really important. And, the opportunity to use your name in more context is quite important. Again, though, we've got to bear in mind that for Russell and colleagues' sample, it's probably quite a supportive sample in terms of parental support. And it may well be that, in a sample more broadly, we might find that parental support or lack of support is actually really important, where here chosen name use is really important in the context of more support at home. Now, Gibson and colleagues, evaluation of anxiety and depression in a community sample of transgender youth. 3 groups of youth between the ages of 8 and 14 in a large community recruited sample. They brought together a total of 375 participants, 148 of whom were transgender. 88 of whom were cisgender siblings of the transgender kids, and 139 were age-matched cisgender controls. And they took a look at the distinction between those who had experienced social transition and their cisgender controls, and their age-matched cisgender controls and their cisgender siblings. And the authors find no significant group differences in self-reported depressive symptoms, self-reported anxiety symptoms, or parent-reported depressive symptoms. The only thing they did find was that parents reported higher rates of anxiety in their transgender youth than in control participants, but not in siblings. So they found that the parents who highlighted anxiety in their trans kids also highlighted similar levels of anxiety in their cisgender siblings, in their other cisgender children. So there is this kind of, this elevation in anxiety. It's not consistent, and it's not in the self-report. It's only in the parent report, and it, is obviously only elevated for the sibling pairing. But it is there. There is a little elevation of anxiety, and we do find that poking its head up in a few of these studies. Again, I do think that social transition, particularly in adolescence, bearing in mind this is between the age of 8 and 14, does seem to provoke a social response, which isn't always that positive, and that can elevate anxiety. I do think that is true. Next up, we have Olson and colleagues, one of my favorites. Olson and colleagues, mental health of transgender children who are supported in their identities, in the journal Pediatrics, which is a pretty beefy journal. 73 transgender prepubescent children aged 3 to 12 were matched along with control groups of non-transgender children in the same age range. So 73 age and gender matched community samples, and 49 of their siblings of transgender kids, all part of the Trans Youth Project. And they asked parents to complete anxiety and depression measures, and they found ultimately that socially transitioned prepubescent trans kids showed typical rates of depression and, again, only slightly elevated rates of anxiety symptoms compared with population averages. Super interesting. They didn't differ on either measure from their two groups of controls, though, either their own siblings or the age and gender matched controls. Interestingly, the trans kids had lower internalizing symptoms than the sort of preclinical range. So they were in the very non-clinical range for internalizing symptoms if they are supported in their gender identities at home. So familial support in general, or specifically via the decision to allow their children to socially transition, seems to be associated with better mental health outcomes among trans kids. Especially in those who get the opportunity to present in everyday life as their gender identity. Those kids who have socially transitioned between the ages of 3 and 12 have what seems like developmentally normative levels of depression and anxiety, although again seemingly slightly elevated rates of anxiety compared to population averages. Again, that sort of slight spike in anxiety, which I think is best explained by the kind of social impact of social transition, i.e. the increased risk of negative responses from wider society and school, etc. Okay, so here's a more controversial study. One of the eight of the prophesized studies. I don't know what that was. Sievert and colleagues, Schweizer and Bachmann, not social transition status, but peer relations and family functioning predict psychological functioning in a German clinical sample of children with gender dysphoria. Clinical Child Psychology and Psychiatry in 2021. Interesting study. So they brought together 54 families, all from the Hamburg Gender Identity Service for Children and Adolescents, and they asked for parental reports of a bunch of different outcome variables. But here's where things got interesting. So they particularly found that global family functioning and social support were the big predictors of psychological outcomes. They didn't find that social transition had any impact on psychological functioning outcomes among these children. Now that's really interesting because they say that in the present study, the social transition status, i.e. living in the preferred gender role in everyday life areas, was not significantly associated with psychological functioning. And that social support in general from family and peers was the sort of thing that played a role for psychological outcomes. But this is a very, very supportive sample. So this is a sample that comes from an almost exclusively middle and high socioeconomic background. And they find that something like 87% of the parents in the sample supported their child's current gender role or social transition completely. So that means that only 7 families didn't completely support their child's current gender role or social transition. So it is, I do think that's probably true in this context. I think it's the same problem with some of the other studies that if you have an extremely positive and gender affirmative family, and a bunch of very positive and gender affirmative families in the research, then you're going to look at kind of family support is going to be a big factor, right? Because they're all affirmative of the child's kind of gender identity and gender expression. Whereas if you had a much greater range of families between affirmative and not affirmative, then you might find that the level of affirmation is the thing that plays a much bigger role than general family functioning. It's quite tricky to interpret, but nonetheless important to note that in this study, we find that general family functioning and social support are really important in children's developmental psychological outcomes. Now, kind of in support of that, we have Van der Vaart and colleagues, differences in self-perception and social gender status in children with gender incongruence in clinical child psychology and psychiatry. They brought together 312 children referred to the Center of Expertise on Gender Dysphoria at the Amsterdam UMC, the Netherlands. 312 children is not a small number. And 62% of their sample were living in their experienced gender identity, had socially transitioned, and 37.8% of the sample had not yet socially transitioned, which I think is really interesting. Now, what they were able to do is compare the people who had socially transitioned when they were referred in to those who had not. And they found that there were no differences between these two groups. Now, they found this a little bit surprising, the authors. They might have expected a difference between the children who had and who had not socially transitioned. But they find, once again, that in this sample, it may well be that because you've got a group of parents who are taking their child into a gender identity clinic, essentially, on the Center of Expertise at Gender Dysphoria, that they may well have a very supportive parental environment at home. And they say that such an environment may improve self-perception already, and then as a result, going through social transition or not, might not further improve self-esteem significantly. Again, finding that parental support is probably the most important factor. Social support, parental support is more important than the act of social transition. But that's only the case, it seems, because we have only this sample to go with very positive, affirmative family circles. I don't know what the case is for children who experience less affirmative experiences. Now, finally, in these group of studies, we have one study that is the study that Hilary Cass is referring to, the study that found that in adolescents, so adults who remember socially transitioning for the first time in adolescence had worse psychological outcomes in some domains than those who report socially transitioning for the first time in adulthood. So let's take a look. This is Turban and colleagues, gotta love it, 2021, timing of social transition for transgender and gender diverse youth, K through 12 harassment and adult mental health outcomes in the Journal of Adolescent Health. Now, this is the huge sample, right, that we've talked about before. This massive 400 community outreach organizations coming together, all 50 states represented, and Puerto Rico and US territories abroad and Washington DC, bringing together 27,715 participants, all adults, all sort of transgender and gender diverse adults, all completing a bunch of questions in a questionnaire asking about their history. Now, we've gone through with this study both the gender affirming hormones kind of part of this study, the hormone blockers part of this study, and amazingly, they've also published a study that is just on social transition. So of the 9,711 participants who had socially transitioned, 165 had socially transitioned in childhood. Again, pretty small number. 1,196 transitioned for the first time in adolescence, and the rest, 8,350, reported social transition for the first time in adulthood. And now we have three different groups: those who transitioned in childhood, those who transitioned in adolescence, and those who transitioned in adulthood. We're just talking about social transition here. Now, of course, these three groups are not particularly similar to one another because, of course, people who socially transitioned younger had an earlier experience of realizing that they had a gender identity that was different to one they were assigned at birth, earlier social transition, earlier recognition of their gender identity. They had different, like the sex assigned at birth wasn't the same between the groups: sexual orientation, race, education level, employment status, relationship status, total household income, and family support for gender identity, and lifetime exposure to gender identity change efforts as well. Having ever received pubertal suppression, having ever received gender affirming hormones were not the same across these groups, because of course they weren't, right? People who reported social transition at younger ages are going to be better supported at home. They are going to have a higher household income. They're going to have better family support of gender identity. So it's not super surprising that these three groups are not identical to each other. I've got to bear that in mind as we consider what we find. Now, they find indeed that people who transitioned for the first time in adolescence reported as adults adverse mental health outcomes, including greater odds of lifetime suicide attempts compared with people who transitioned as adults. Now, that's really interesting, of course, but turbulent. And so that's what they said. That's what Hilary Cass has highlighted, that people who transitioned in adolescence had a greater odds of lifetime suicide attempts when compared to those who transitioned in adulthood. But those associations are no longer significant if you adjust for K through 12 harassment. Super, super important, right? So if you don't adjust for K through 12 harassment, right, the experience of harassment based on your gender identity, social transition during adolescence is associated with greater odds of lifetime suicide attempts, past year suicidal ideation as well. But it's no longer the case if you adjust for K through 12 harassment, if you control for K through 12 harassment on the basis of gender identity. So what we're finding, which I think we've said before in the social transition episode, as we kind of look at the Cass review part 3 today on social transition, we find similarly, distinct from what Cass says, right? Bearing in mind what Hilary Cass and the team said, one study looking at transgender adults found that lifetime suicide attempts and suicidal ideation in the past year was higher among those who had socially transitioned as adolescents compared to those who had socially transitioned as adulthood. But what they fail to say, what they omit, is that this is purely because of the increased risk of social harassment. When you control for the harassment, the relationship is no longer significant. So it's a bit of an oversight at best from the Cass review here, that the challenge here is that social transition exposes children and young people to the potential for harassment. But that shouldn't be an argument for not socially transitioning. That should be an argument for tackling the risk of harassment, right? We need to create a world where everyone can find a place to belong, fundamentally. Now, the other thing that the Cass review did, and the systematic review did, because of course the systematic review is focused very heavily on like the social outcomes and on like on the sort of metrics, right? They're very focused on the social and psychological outcomes as measured in a psychometric measuring scale. They're not super interested in the qual research. And so they left out some really important work that's qualitative in nature. And the one that I really want to focus on is Cal Horton's. In 2022, I was losing that sense of her being happy. Trans children and delaying social transition. LGBTQ plus family and interdisciplinary journal. So it gets super interesting, right? So the one thing that we could not do with any of those 8 studies that the systematic review couldn't do is highlight what happens when you do the opposite, right? All we can do, because we're gathering data from all these kind of, from gender identity clinics, from social support groups, we're gathering data from parents who are supportive of their young person. And it's very difficult in those contexts to know what the effects of delaying social transition can be. And there really is no quant research to answer that question. The systematic review couldn't find it because I don't think I could find it either. I don't think it exists. But there is some qual research that might give us a bit of a sense. Now, of course, we can't generalize from this qual research, but it still gives us a deep insight into the experiences of families. Now, these are all UK families, parents who, for one reason or another, delayed their child's social transition, and they answered questions and got into conversation about what that experience was like. So rather than, knowing what the quant outcomes are, we can definitely still get a very deep insight into what that experience was like for these parents, for these families. Just take a look. So these are parents of 30 trans children in the UK who socially transitioned on average of 7, ranged 3 to 10 years of age. And Cal Horton used a reflexive thematic analysis. And this is what parents had to say. Direct quotation. What I watched was my child become more and more and more unhappy because we were still using male pronouns and we were still using birth name and the playing with toys you want and, dressing in the clothes you want, it didn't matter. That wasn't what this was about for her. For her, it was, I need you to see me as the girl I know who I am. And we weren't doing that. Another quote. From about the age of 5, say 5 or 6, we were saying, you can be any kind of boy you want. We enrolled her in boys' ballet class, which she loved. And, boys can do anything. Boys can like ballet. Boys can wear what you want and everything. But then I would say she was very much saying, no, but I'm a girl. And there was a lot of sadness. My partner used to say, we'll put obstacles in the way. And if he can overcome them, then we'll follow his lead. So it's not just blindly following his lead and saying, whatever you want, darling, we'll support you. We did put up those hurdles. And I literally had hurdles in my mind that if he needs to try to get over the hurdles, and if he can, then we'll follow his lead. But those hurdles were definitely there. They were things like he did ask to be called his name at least 10 times. So there are 10 different hurdles. And every time he kept on going to the next one and kept on going to the next one, and he didn't give up. If he had given up and stopped asking, then we wouldn't have done anything. We wouldn't have moved forward. I needed absolute clarity on what he was asking. He had to demonstrate that he was absolutely certain, and he did. Another parent described challenging their child on their certainty, requiring their child to repeatedly assert their need for support to the point of the child becoming frustrated. Direct quote. I delayed things to the point where I knew that he meant it. But any further than that, that already to me felt like I was pushing it a bit. Are you sure? Are you sure? You should just leave it another month. See if he complains again. That already was making him quite frustrated. Another quote. We did try to keep her, as a boy for my gosh, a couple of years probably. And it got harder and harder. It was daily arguments. If, in the house, she was, dressed as a girl, but leaving the house was a nightmare because she didn't want to wear boy stuff. She wasn't comfortable in it. Getting a haircut was a nightmare. It was just a nightmare. So there's nothing I don't think that we could have delayed it any longer than we did, in all honesty. And one final quote. This one touched me. But I think if I had not done what I did in terms of supporting social transition and supporting her pronoun, she'd have had a bloody unhappy couple of years. If I'd stuck to what they'd said in terms of watchful waiting, I don't know where we'd really be right now. She was so desperately unhappy. I think if I hadn't said, you can be who you want to be, I don't know, I dread to think where we'd be now. We're really close. And just, and she's such a happy little soul. And I was losing that. I was losing that sense of her being happy. And the interviewee became visibly upset. I think from these quotes, I realize that we can't overly generalize from them. But I think these remind us that parents are in a really difficult position. And these parents clearly just want what's best for their children. And I can understand that. I think schools do too, in a very challenging circumstance. They don't know the right way forward. But as we look through this whole field of literature together, I think we can say that, social support and parental support are really, really important, particularly when it comes to children who are relatively well affirmed in their gender at home. But that is not always the case, and that parents go through a process of coming to terms with and understanding and ultimately affirming their children's identity, because it's not something that children choose, and it's not something that you can discourage or indeed encourage. It seems that it's something that children come to discover on their own, and when they are insistent and consistent and persistent and in that kind of distress, when you start to lose that sense of them being happy, well, parents seem that they find a way to create a world for their children where everyone can find a place to belong. I don't think we should be afraid of social transition. I think gender diverse children and young people need our help, as do their families, as do schools, to create contexts in which they feel supported to find what's right for them. Beyond that, we just need to make sure that families and schools feel like a cohesive unit so that our functioning and support of gender diverse children is as good as it can be. This is Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. You